Good morning. I'm Megan O'Sullivan. I'm the chair of the North America Trilateral Commission. I know we've got some more people filtering in, but I wanted to welcome you all and to say how excited I am for today's conversation. We're really lucky to be joined by Dan Yergin, who is well known to this entire crowd, certainly a man who needs no introduction, and Helima Croft, who is also a real expert in her own right and a new member to the Trilateral Commission. So we're joined by two of our own, and I would say one of the best duos we could have to talk about energy and geopolitics. So Dan, as you know, I would consider him, or I think he is broadly considered, not just by me, but by the whole entourage of experts in this field. He is the energy guru, really the global expert on the intersection of energy and geopolitics, someone who I have read and looked up to in my career as I have worked on this field, and a person who is always on the forefront of giving us analysis about this constantly changing dynamic, and one that I think the energy realm is probably underappreciated in terms of its impact on global politics. So Dan is well known for a trilogy. Now we're not calling it a trilogy of books, the first of which is The Prize, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize, and the second called The Quest, and the third is called The New Map. You'll see it right over his left shoulder there. It's a fabulous read, and I commend it to all of you. It is both comprehensive and incredibly interesting, cataloging not only history, but also talking about the energy transition. And that's what we're here to hear him talk about today, just about this intersection of energy and geopolitics. And again, Helima Croft is going to lead us through that conversation. And Helima is the managing director and global head of commodity research at RBC Capital Markets. And as I mentioned, Helima also is a real expert in this area. She's someone that I turn to for lots of advice on various aspects of this, but particular on the Middle East, although her range goes far beyond that. So, and welcome everyone. Unusual, and I'm sure. Over to you, Helima.
Great, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. And Megan, thank you for your fantastic introduction. And Dan, I could spend the next hour actually going through everything that you've accomplished and every book that you've written and all of your fantastic analysis, but I wanted to get right into it. And so basically, Dan, the big question on my mind is, when I picked up the book, is what is the new map of energy, climate, and the clash of nations? I mean, how did you come up with this title? You go through all the different cartographers and their important impact on geopolitics. Like, what is the new map?
Thank you, Helima, and I'm very glad to be on with you. Great respect for your work, and of course, Megan's work in this area as well. As somebody described the book as geopolitical cartography, what I really meant by the new map is just how much it changed in a decade in all these different dimensions affecting energy and geopolitics. It's a new terrain, and by the new map was meant to be a guide or a framework for how these new pieces fit together, everything from climate to shale, and of course the change in the geopolitical configuration in the world as well. So all of that is what led me to the title of the new map, because the terrain had shifted so dramatically.
Well, you start the book talking about the United States, and I'm wondering if you could talk about really like what has changed because of the shale revolution. I mean, how has this altered geopolitics? How has this altered the energy landscape? I mean, if you were writing the postscript to The Prize, how would you talk about the shale revolution?
Well, I think it was striking that, of course, shale was certainly not even a factor in The Prize, and it was only just touched upon in The Quest, which came out in 2011. And it's the largest, biggest innovation in energy, in this century. And it changed the position of the United States, went from importing 60% of its oil to being essentially energy independent. Big impact on the manufacturing sector. I remember a few years ago having Ben Bernanke at our conference in Houston, and he at IHS Markit conference, and he said that the shale revolution had been one of the most positive things, maybe the most positive thing to have happened to the U.S. After the financial crisis. Several million jobs came out of it, balance of payment came out of it, over $200 billion of investment in new factories, and I think a shift in geopolitics in quite a dramatic way that we're still assimilating.
I mean, because President Trump likes to talk a lot about American energy dominance. And how do you think about the shale revolution and what it has given the United States in terms of foreign policy? And are there limits to that? Because we certainly saw when the price war commenced between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and we had the big crash in demand, President Trump had to start calling Saudi Arabia and calling Russia and asking them once again to restrain output. So I'm wondering if you could think about sort of what it has given us and what are the limits of the shale revolution?
Well, first, I think energy dominance was an unfortunate phrase because the U.S. is not dominant. It's one of the big three in terms of oil production, although interestingly, the U.S. is now the world's largest oil producer. And the U.S. is the largest producer of natural gas, but there are a lot of other people who do it. Well, I think what it did do is it first has given the U.S. flexibility in foreign policy, whether the Obama approach to Iran or the Trump approach or what may be the Biden approach. There's flexibility with Iran because Iran's oil, the Iranians thought the nuclear deal that Obama the sanctions wouldn't work, and because the world needed their oil, it turned out it didn't need their oil. So you see that flexibility that comes from it. But secondly, it also, in a sense, made the U.S. a player in a way that would have been unimaginable in the past. As you said, Helima, the price of oil collapsed. The price actually went negative.
Yes.
And at that time, it was obviously a big threat to the U.S. industry and to many others. And of all things, the United States is the one who brokered the deal between Saudi Arabia and Russia when they were having a price war. It's almost has been described as marriage counseling because after the deal was over, after the deal was made, the Saudi oil minister said, well, we don't have to go to the divorce lawyers after all. And you just would not have comprehended the U.S. being able to do that. We don't know if the next president would do it, but it's a position that the U.S. is now in.
And just sticking with this theme just for one more minute, I wanted to ask you about the attacks that we saw last year on Gulf energy infrastructure. I mean, it was amazing on September 14th when we had that cruise missile and drone strike on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq facility and basically knocked out half of Saudi Arabia's oil production for a temporary period. But the market really didn't move that much. And then there was a whole question of would the US intervene in some way? And people were really questioning whether we even had the Carter Doctrine anymore and whether this American energy resource had really altered our position in the Middle East, that we no longer saw these energy assets as a core national security interest to protect. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where is the Carter Doctrine and where is the Middle East now?
First, the first thing that was striking, as you've suggested, in the past, if you knocked out the most important infrastructure in the world oil industry, that Abqaiq facility and the other one, the price would have gone through the roof. There would have been panic. Maybe the panic, I don't know, lasted 24, 48 hours. Partly the Saudis were able to repair it. But I think that's another example that you had this big thing over here called U.S. shale. And the market basically just shrugged, actually, after a couple of days. That was very striking. I think the U.S. did follow through with helping the Saudis with their defense, but I think it also, it played in, I believe, with the United Arab Emirates treaty with Israel, because I think there is a sense among those countries that the kind of driving interest that the U.S. had in the region just won't necessarily be there in the future, and that the countries in the region like the UAE have to sort of look at a different way of addressing their defense issues and their security issues. So I think with time, the question, it will be harder to explain why is the U.S. So engaged in the region at such time as Iran is no longer seen as a threat to the region. I think as long as Iran is there, of course, the U.S. is deeply engaged. But I think that has been in the mind of some of those countries really since it became clear that the shale revolution was not a bubble, but it would really change the configuration of the global market and the position of the United States.
Well, now I want to turn to China, and to all the participants on the line, I will be opening it up in a few minutes for questions. And so if you can raise your hand or text the question, I have my glasses on, so I will try to start calling on everybody in a few minutes. But I want to turn to China because China occupies such a central place in your book. And you talk a lot about sort of the future of great power rivalry between the United States and China. And energy is such an important part of that story. And so I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about this. And you talk a lot about the Thucydides trap or you reference it in the book. Do you subscribe to that, to the sort of thesis about the potential for conflict?
Well, I found that the Thucydides trap, which Professor Allison, Graham Allison, Megan, and Joe Nye's colleague wrote about, to find actually very compelling. And because it seemed to me that there were too many echoes of pre-World War One here. Now, in Henry Kissinger's book on China, he talks about that in the epilogue. Then he says, by definition, historical analogies are inexact. But you certainly see a dramatic change, as most of the people on this call know. If you 5 years ago, there was a very different attitude towards China, 5 or 6 than today. One of the few things that unites Democrats and Republicans is this sense that China is a strategic rival, great power competition, and the Chinese are using the same language. And I found I didn't expect to spend as much time looking at the 9-dash line in the South China Sea as I did. And of course, my curiosity was, where did the 9-dash line come from? And actually, from the French archives, I found the reports of the French captain who sailed with 3 ships to claim these islands in the South China Sea in the 1930s, and then the Chinese reaction. And it was a Chinese geographer who in 1936 drew the 9-dash line, basically, which the nationalists and then the communists adopted. But it seems, if you look at it, there's 2 different realities about that body of water through which traverses 1/3 of world trade, through which pass the same number of oil tankers as go through the Strait of Hormuz every day. And the Chinese very concerned about, if something happens with Taiwan, what the US Navy would be able to do for their oil supply. So it's interesting with the China part of the book, it really was kind of also grounded in maps, the 9-dash line and the map of the Belt and Road, the 6 maps of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I wrote my first book on the origins of the Cold War, and I never expected to be writing another book where I talk about origins of possible new Cold Wars. Yeah. But I think, day by day, with step by step, it seems to be moving in that direction. And just to add one other thing, it's striking, before World War I, the technology that was the most crucial technology was battleships between Germany and Britain. And today it's technology, but of course, I think Huawei is, in a sense, the great symbol of this unexpected clash. I went back and looked at what previous presidents said about the relationship with China, how Bill Clinton said the most important economic initiative of his administration was bringing China into the WTO. You wouldn't find anybody talking about partnership with a changing China today, or in Washington, I think.
Sticking with China, I want to talk about, a big theme of your book is obviously on the climate challenge, and you have a great section on EVs. And the role that China plays in control of supply chains, the component parts for lithium batteries. How are we thinking about sort of the geopolitics of renewables? If it is made in China, what are the potential issues around this whole race for the electrification of everything? And I mean, would that be your next book? Is there a prize of renewables?
Well, I think my next project is exactly on the supply chains and trying to understand them in a very granular way. I know Megan has written about kind of starting to think about the geopolitics of renewables. And, until a few years ago, supply chains were about economics, were about technology, about efficiency. But now they're also increasingly about geopolitics, and in many different ways we see that. And I think when you look at the numbers involved in seriously moving to net zero carbon, you're talking about installing, for instance, electric capacity of wind and solar that's twice all of the physical capacity that now exists in the global electric power industry. And I think that there's just been this assumption, well, because the wind is free and the sun is free, that these are free, but they're not free. They involve lots and lots of materials. And China does have a very strong position in what they call the new energies. 70% roughly of the solar panels come from China, another 10% come from Chinese companies elsewhere. I was just talking to some Indians about India trying to disassociate some Chinese supply chains. So went to other companies. It turned out they were Chinese companies as well. I hear the same thing on batteries. Yeah. And you say lithium-ion batteries and rare earths. You kind of go down the list. China is very well positioned in a way that people didn't pay attention to before.
Okay, now again, I'm getting ready to turn it over to questions, but I wanted to ask you about Russia because Russia was in the news yesterday with the State Department imposing new sanctions on companies that are assisting with the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project. I mean, I think it's almost 94% completed, and the United States is doubling down on efforts to block this pipeline. And you do spend a lot of time in your book talking about the long history of the US to try to sort of break Russia's hold on European gas markets. Can you talk about why we're still doing this and sort of the economics of Russia right now? Like how are they positioned in this transition?
It's Helima, as you say, it is a long history. It's been about 70 years in which the US has periodically tried to prevent Russian oil and then natural gas exports. There was a now long forgotten Republican senator from the state of New York saying that the Soviets wanted to drown us in a sea of Russian oil. And that started during really the Kennedy administration. Some of the people on this call will certainly remember in the 1980s when the US wanted to block a gas pipeline. Finally, a deal was made with the IEA, I think, as being part of it, to kind of cap the amount of Russian gas. It was very contentious. And George Shultz, in the course of that, made a remark that I think continues to resonate. He said sanctions are a wasting asset in many cases. And it took the Russians about a year to replace US equipment. And we're there now. And just yesterday, I heard one of the people in the administration saying, we want to prevent Russia from having leverage or stranglehold on European energy. Well, the numbers don't bear that out for two reasons. One is that the Europeans have made their gas system very flexible. And two, it's LNG, liquefied natural gas. The Europeans have choices and the market is competitive and prices have gone down. But it was so striking to me, when you sit down to write, you see how something happens over there and over there. President Trump signed the legislation as he was just in December, just as he was from Andrews Air Force Base, that put the first sanctions in place. About that same time, just about 2 weeks earlier, a week earlier, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping in two different locations, one in Sochi, one in Beijing, and then were connected in this very elaborate ceremony to control stations on the Russian-Chinese border. And they pulled the switch on the Power of Siberia pipeline, massive pipeline. And to me, it kind of, it resonated that on the one hand, we want to block this, but the future is this pivot to the east and this Russian-Chinese relationship, which some people say, oh, we can pry them apart. I don't think we can pry them apart in these circumstances.
Well, I want to follow on with that because I actually got to interview Brian Hook yesterday, and it was on the record, so I can talk about it. And I talked about your book, and I said to Brian, we talk about the Yamal LNG project, and that potentially doesn't show the limits of U.S. sanctions pressure, the fact that project sort of went forward despite all the sanctions we imposed on Russia after 2014. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the limits of sanctions on Russia, the importance of this project, and can Russia simply just turn east and find a way of circumventing these measures?
Well, I think I think that was a very clear example because as a result of that, for the first time, the Russians allowed direct Chinese investment in their energy sector. The Chinese just stepped in and replaced the Western funding that was prohibited from being part of that. So I think it's actually accentuated that. And just to, kind of when we could still travel, as at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, and there was Putin and Xi on the stage together. And this didn't get reported, but I was very fascinated by the dialogue because Putin apologizes to Xi, said, I kept you up till 4 a.m. talking Beijing time, I apologize. And Xi said, oh, it's not a problem. We never have enough time to talk. And I assume that two of the things they talk about, one is about energy and the other is about the United States.
Okay, I want to talk about, sort of almost take you back to one of your first books that I read when I was in graduate school, The Commanding Heights. And there's an article today in Politico talking about the COVID-19 pandemic has really sort of set advocates for globalization sort of back on their heels. I mean, how do you think about COVID-19? How do you think about, you mentioned the whole issue about securing supply chains. If you were writing the postscript to Commanding Heights, how would you talk about this period now in terms of globalization?
I would say that the pendulum is swinging back from open markets, open trade, open travel. When the Chinese threatened that if some professor from Harvard or some other university goes to China, they might arrest that professor in retaliation for arrest of Chinese academics in the United States. It's kind of a clarion call about how things have changed. And I think the handling, just like the COVID-19, under other circumstances, there would have been a kind of combined international effort, coordinated effort to address this, good communication instead of accusations back and forth, instead of the US quitting the World Health Organization, trying to quit it. So I think in a sense, what we've seen COVID is a symptom of many things, but one of it is that, let's call it a fragmentation of globalization, because the connections are still very deep. The Chinese have $1.5 trillion of US debt. GM still sells more cars in China than it does in the United States, but it's going to get more difficult, more barriers, more contentious, and more angry. And this push towards protectionism to kind of nationalism, I think it's going to be tough for international companies that have the playbook of globalization. So it is, it's kind of a return to the commanding heights that turns out these changes are not permanent. And I think to get kind of to rebalance again, it's going to be challenging given what's happened the last few years.
Well, last question from me till I turn it over, and I have plenty more that I can ask you, but the last one I want to ask for now is about peak demand. There has been a lot of discussion. I feel like every conference, the theme is peak demand. And we have a number of outstanding experts who are arguing that we may have seen peak demand already. Where are you on the whole issue of peak demand? And you have also on the issue of peak US supply as well. You have American CEOs of energy companies saying, well, if we didn't have peak demand in 2019, we may have had peak US supply. So I wonder if you could talk about those twin issues.
Okay. Well, for those who don't follow this closely, they'll remember 10 or 12 years ago, there was this discussion of peak oil, and it was a notion the world was going to run out of oil really soon and needed to do something else. Then along came the shale revolution, among other things, and other resources like deepwater Brazil and so forth. And now the discussion is, as you say, Helima, about peak demand. And, it's, what's the saying, that phrase, avoid prophecy, especially about the future.
Yes.
There are a lot of people prophesizing about it. I think in general that it is premature in the middle of this crisis to generalize about what will happen afterwards. Obviously, some things have changed. 7 years of digitalization in 7 months. The fact that we're doing this, there'll be changes on travel, there'll be changes on commuting. But so you have, for instance, one company, if you read in the press, it says BP says demand is already peaked for oil. Right. Turns out, if you read it, it's one of 3 or 4 scenarios, and it's one scenario. Another one, it doesn't really peak for another, 20 years, 15 years. Yesterday, I was doing a dialogue with the CEO of one of the other major companies, and he said between in a very Gallic way, so somewhere between, he shrugged, between 2030 and 2040. The view I take in the new map is that, first of all, demand will recover probably mid-2021, well, really 2022, if there is a successful vaccine, or maybe that should be in plural, and economic activity resumes. Demand in 2022 will probably get back towards where we were in 2019. By the way, people think demand has collapsed. It's this year, as you know, Helima, it's down. It'll be down 10%. It's not really. That's a big drop, but it's not like a 50% collapse like it looked like in April. So I still think rising incomes, rising growing population will be, in the kind of early 2030s probably. We're doing our India Energy Forum, of course, virtually this year, and the Indian plans show their oil demand almost doubling between now and 2040. So I think that some of the discussions really fail to take into account rising incomes, rising population. So on this contentious, much argued, as you say, every conference issue of peak demand, I would be in the view that when we come out of this, unless we have very poor economic situation for a number of years, that it doesn't come tomorrow, but it comes in a decade or so, a little more than a decade.
And just on that, Colorado, can we talk about peak supply? Do you think there is peak U.S. supply as well? Have we sort of seen the end of explosive growth of U.S. shale production?
Absolutely. The U.S. in February, on the eve of the crisis, U.S. production reached 13 million barrels a day, which was incredible, going from 5 million barrels a day a little more than a decade ago. Never seen, as you describe it, Helima, as such explosive growth. And that was why shale was a huge disruptive technology for the global markets. I think that we're in a period, we've seen another major deal announced yesterday or today, that period of consolidation. I think US production at the end of the year will probably be down from 13 million to between 10.5 and 11 million barrels a day. And then I think it recovers sometime in the third quarter of next year, but at a much more gradual rate. So it's no longer a disruptive technology. It's part of the market. I think Middle East producers just recognize that it's there. I think some very powerful Russians really hated to see giving up market share to the United States and didn't mind low prices. Other Russians ultimately disagreed, including the most important Russian, and they made their deal, of course. So I think, but it will be there. It'll be still, this was an industry that was over 12 million jobs before COVID. It'll come back as a significant sector of the U.S. economy. Of course, we've seen that gets us into the political discussion and the evolution in the position of Joe Biden, where he went out of his way now to say he won't ban fracking. He said he would ban it on federal lands. So far, that won't matter a great deal, except in Mexico.
Well, now I am going to open it up for questions. And the first question goes to Tanaka-san. You had your hand up fast.
Thank you very much. Hi, Dan. How are you?
Hi there.
Very good. I really enjoy your remarks. And my question, do you remember that we were both invited to the Saudi Aramco's board meeting held in Tokyo about 6 years ago? And that the question we were given by the Saudi Aramco CEO, that time is Al Fari, was when the peak demand of oil would come. And I was really shocked to hear that. How are you seriously asking both of us when the peak demand of oil coming? And they said, yeah, because electric vehicle is now coming, climate change mitigation. There are many countries committing to the carbon neutral. So we were dead serious about when the peak demand of oil coming. And we say maybe 2030. I said before 2030. But the thing is moving very rapidly these days, thanks to the COVID-19. My view is, you mentioned about BP and even IEA is saying maybe if the government's policy is getting tougher, maybe peak demand could have happened already. So, or within 10 years, the peak demand is coming. My guess is, we are kind of based on the supply side, but the demand side driven transformation is rather quick because after COVID-19, the investors moving toward the digitalization or digital transformation. The money is going to mega tech 5 companies or Tesla, and they are digital company, but at the same time, they claim renewable energy 100 corporation. So digital transformation and together with the sustainability transformation is now in a very rapid motion. So these companies like Apple ask the supply chain companies to do the same. So they will not buy any parts who are making their components by coal power plants. They request wherever you are, in China, in Japan, in Europe, they ask these vendors to be a sustainable company. So this kind of demand side and also TCFD or banking financial sector is urging ESG type investment. So I am rather, somewhat urged to say maybe peak demand of oil may come much earlier and even could have happened already 2019. So conventional wisdom is maybe about within a year, within 10 years or so. But I think this transformation with COVID is very much, destroying the conventional wisdom. What do you think? You are the man of wisdom in energy sector. I am rather a newcomer, but
oh no, come on.
What do you think of this transformation, Dan?
No, I think that look, the direction is clear. So it's really a question of timing. What my underlying view is the scale of the existing system. An $87 trillion global economy that was 84% supported by fossil fuels, under 4% by renewables. Mm-hmm. But it's clear that utilities in particular are the ones who are trying to move under a lot of pressure. And I think you point to something very important, which is the pressure coming from investors. But I think it's the scale. I mean, take we know that all the automakers are not investing in internal combustion engine, they're investing in EVs. But it's the scale of getting there. Last year, 2.2% of world car sales were EVs. That number will increase, but at least when we have it in IHS Markit, we have several hundred people who work just on automotive analysis. And the numbers that we have is 1.4 billion cars today, 2050, 1.92 billion cars, 600 million of them EVs. But by that point, as you're suggesting, 60 to 80% of new cars will be, that people are buying, will be electric vehicles. But it's a question of time and scale to achieve that. And China has their goals for 2060 now, but they are still 60% of their total energy comes from coal. Just how quickly can these things change? So, but I think the pressures are there, and I think the pressures, A, from governments, and B, as you say, from customers, but C, I think particularly noteworthy is the pressure from investors. And it's a little hard to disentangle how much of it is poor economic returns and how much is ESG. But certainly I can see, companies feeling much greater pressure on that. So all those forces are there. It's a question of how long does it take to get there. And by the way, what's going to happen in terms of we did, Ernie Moniz and I led a study for Bill Gates Foundation, and it was about all the technologies that are needed that are not there now. And one of the big areas of technology is carbon capture of one sort or another. Mm-hmm. So, like there are 15 cargoes this year of carbon-free LNG has been delivered. So you say, how is carbon-free LNG? You buy offsets of one kind or another. So I think that's going to be part of the picture too. So I think the direction's there. I'm just it's just the scale of what's involved.
Yeah.
And then when you do talk to, let's say, if I could just focus on India, because I know that very well because of our involvement there. The Indians want to go full speed on solar and wind. They would like not to buy solar panels from China. But also, they're saying we also have this problem that hundreds of millions of people cook with waste wood, waste product, and so forth. And the World Health Organization says that's the single biggest environmental problem in the world is indoor air pollution. And so India also has a $60 billion project to use more natural gas, to build up a natural gas system. So for them, an energy transition is not what it is in the Netherlands, but it's actually both renewables, but also commercial energy replacing traditional energy. And so so that's kind of informs my view. But if you think of all the surprises in the last 10 years, I would say why will there be fewer surprises in the next 10 years?
What do you think about the hydrogen? Because to decarbonize fossil fuel, the hydrogen with CCS is one answer. And also, abundant renewables can be stored as hydrogen. So
well, that's
blue
certainly
hydrogen, green hydrogen, you can name it. LNG, instead of LNG, maybe hydrogen trade, either in ammonia or other chemical way. What do you think about this potential of hydrogen to create a decarbonization?
So again, some of you may remember when Governor Schwarzenegger was governor in California, he introduced 15 years ago the hydrogen highway. At that point, the hydrogen highway ended up going nowhere. Hydrogen is a really hot subject now because it involves large scale engineering. It's something that, every single major energy company, I can tell you, every single one of them is looking at hydrogen now and saying, how do we play in this game? How can we use hydrogen to replace natural gas? And, how can we we have pipelines for hydrogen and so forth. So, but I would also say that, hydrogen from renewables is a much more complicated project than hydrogen from natural gas.
Right.
So again, for those who don't follow it, particularly in the EU, there's blue hydrogen, which comes from natural gas, and green hydrogen, which comes from using spare wind and solar to get there. I would say it's a hot subject, but it's very, very early stages, and everybody's just, one of the major companies is just setting up their hydrogen unit to understand it. So it's not something that's tomorrow, but could well be part of the mix.
Thank you. Yeah, Saudi Arabia is thinking seriously about hydrogen and ammonia. That is surprising, like green or blue, both. So we'll see.
Exactly. Your point's very well taken. And, it is the speed of, technology dispersion, really. But, one of the things I say in the new map is that the energy transition began in 1709 when an English metal worker figured out you could use coal to make better, as he put it, better iron than using wood as your fuel. And we've been in energy transition ever since then, and we're in one now. What's different now is that it's driven not just by economics, but driven by popular opinion, by government policy, by financial institutions. So that has an accelerator. But for the EU to go in 30 years from where it is today to be net zero carbon, that's really rebuilding their entire energy foundation.
Right.
And one of the things, again, is that, I think there's going to be this argument or this debate between, let's say, ecology ministers and finance ministers as to where you put your money, how much goes into recovering an economy in which small business has been devastated, and how much goes into, trying to accelerate the movement towards a greener and greener and greener economy.
So,
Thank you.
Dan, we had a follow-on question about EV penetration and penetration rates in the US, EU, and Asia. And I was struck in your book where you basically said that the biggest market for Tesla is Norway. Can you talk about sort of where you see the sort of pace of adoption?
Right. Well, I think Norway, in relative terms, I think that the pressures on the automakers, particularly in Europe, and I don't know about Japan, Tanaka-san can address that. But basically, if they don't meet the targets that started this year and next year for lower and lower carbon in their fleets, they would be facing penalties of over $40 billion. You could see actually, yesterday there was a story about battery engine fires, and Ford saying they're having to hold up their moving forward with EVs because of that, and therefore they're going to have to go to other automakers and pay credits, or otherwise they face fines. So I think that pressure is there, and if governments are willing to subsidize, you can speed it up. And so I think Europe is a place where it will be the fastest. But of course, Norway, not in absolute numbers, Tesla,
Right, of course.
but in percentage terms.
Yes.
Because you'd really have something wrong if you didn't buy an electric car in Norway, because basically you'd pay twice as much for a conventional engine. So government policies will be a very big driver for the automobile industry. And autos, people, you got to look at the numbers. Autos are about 6% of CO2, combustion-related CO2 in the atmosphere. To keep that number in mind. But the pressure will be there on automakers, but you need to get the consumers on board too and have the system there. In California, on one hand, get an electric car, on the other hand, you have unreliable electricity.
Right. No, and we look at car sales are apparently soaring now in China and India, but it's for the internal combustion engine cars as well.
Right. China, there's incentive. There's a reason China has half the EVs, because there they see electric cars not only about less oil and pollution, but they want to leapfrog in the automobile industry, and they can't do it with internal combustion engines. And so therefore, if they can be leaders in EVs, and there are a whole host of incentives and encouragements to get people to buy EVs in China.
So I think Robert Johnson wanted to come in with a question. Robert, are you here?
I am. Hey, Helima.
Hi. Hi.
Hi. Hey, Dan. Congratulations on the latest book. I'm really excited to look forward to reading it. I wanted to follow up on something you guys have been talking about in a couple places, which is the industry's ability to access capital. We know, of course, that energy used to be 13 or 14% of the S&P. Now it's only 2%. And whether or not Tanaka-san and yourself and I and Helima all agree that peak demand is still a couple decades away, the market seems to think it's imminent and seems to be very hesitant to allocate capital to the oil and gas sector. Are you concerned about the implications of that, including on geopolitics?
Well, I think it's an interesting question to ask further about the geopolitics. I think that question of access to capital is something that very dominates managements. And it goes back to a combination of returns and the ESG, both there. And I think the shale producers, I think shale revolution was already headed for a second revolution prior to COVID, because it was called give money back to investors. It's no longer growth at any cost, it's growth at what cost. And I think you see the companies very much, even shale producers talking about variable dividends. So I think there's going to continue to be a segment of investors who will invest in the industry, but they're going to want returns. But it's certainly going to be challenging access to capital. I think that's one reason you've seen the big European oil and gas companies now saying that they're energy companies and looking at offshore wind, looking at hydrogen, looking at being in the electric charging business, that they know that they need to kind of create a new dialogue with their investors because they see their shrinking access to the pool of investors declining. And it is quite, as you say, it's an amazing decrease from what it is before. Now, part of it, of course, is, the winners in COVID, which are the tech companies. And what are they? Tech companies are now 40% of the market. But I think that question of access to capital weighs on the entire industry.
Yeah, Dan, I just worry in that scenario that we might get a case, and I think the IEA has talked about this, where maybe supply will fall faster than demand, right? That if you pull the big European super majors out and they're not doing as much exploration and bringing on new projects, that yes, demand may be slowing and then will plateau and decline, but maybe supply declines a lot faster. That's something I'm starting to hear more and more from the IEA and others.
Well, there is particularly, the investment, the major companies in general have cut their budgets by 30%, large independents by over 50%. And, BP said it's not going to explore in new countries.
Right.
Total takes a different view, saying we're still going to be in the oil business for a long time. But I think that the level of activity, and also, U.S. independents used to go out of the country and were the people who would find new oil, but they're very focused on the Permian or the Eagle Ford, or the shale plays in the United States. So I think there are some who think that, 2023, 24, we could actually see a tight market. I don't know, Helima, that's something you look at as well. You want to come in on that?
No, I think that is the really interesting question. I think there's a whole geopolitical dimension to that as well, because if you do start to see falling supply, coming out of the U.S. and then, in these sort of conventional projects, who is the last man standing in terms of who's producing the cheapest and greenest barrel? So I actually think that you could really have, greater concentration of production, in the Persian Gulf as well. And I think that's where there's an interesting sort of geopolitical dynamic to this. I think they say the last barrel of oil is going to be produced in the Middle East, and in an energy transition scenario, we are going to be the ones who have that bigger share of a smaller pie. So I think there is a very interesting geopolitical dimension to that. But yes.
And I was just going to say, there are some countries that would really like to see fracking banned in the United States, because they would be very big beneficiaries of that. So that adds to it as well.
So we have another question, and coming from a Canadian bank, I would be remiss if I didn't ask this question. Is Canadian oil sands production fundamentally uneconomic for the foreseeable future? And I'm giving that one to you, Dan.
No, I don't think so.
I'm not taking it.
Yeah, the cost of Canadian oil sands, particularly when it's already been invested, these are very long-lived assets. They're very different kind of assets. They don't have a decline in them. In fact, our view is that Canadian oil production will go up another 1 million barrels a day over the next several years, not from new projects, which would be expensive, but from extensions of existing projects. The big problem for Canadian oil is getting to the market, and that gets you to pipelines. So on the one hand, we talk about, the potential choking off of finance. The other is the choking off of pipelines. So the critical question, is for Canadian oil, I think, is its ability to access markets, not only in North America, i.e. the United States, but also in Asia.
And can I then sort of wrap it up before I hand it back to the amazing Megan O'Sullivan? Can we talk about the impact of the election then? Because the issue of pipelines, in terms of, fracking, in terms of, subsidies for the industry, that all seems in play in this election. So how consequential do you think this election is for the energy landscape?
I think it's very consequential. It goes back to some of the questions Mr. Tanaka raised initially about government policy. We could summarize it in one way. Joe Biden has a $2 trillion climate plan. Donald Trump does not have a $2 trillion climate plan, for sure. And I think that the Biden administration, particularly with a Democratic Senate, would move in the direction of what you see European energy policy now. He said, as we noted before, that wouldn't ban fracking, but there'd be a lot more regulation, a lot more constriction. The question that Robert Johnson raised about finance would come to the fore. You would have, I think the Trump SEC has questioned claims that ESG investing brings a bit better returns. I think a Biden SEC would probably be promoting ESG. So I think it would have a big impact on energy policy and the direction in a much stronger way than it did under Obama. And that would affect pipeline approvals or non-approvals. I'll just say the permitting process in the United States is crazy. To have an extension of a pipeline in Minnesota to replace an old pipeline with a new one under review for 5 years. I have this great picture in the book of Obama dedicating the lower third of the Keystone XL pipeline in 2012, when gasoline was $5 a gallon. Joe Biden would not be dedicating any pipelines, I think. So, in fact, I would watch very carefully what happens with pipelines in the future. So, very big difference, and accentuated if there's a clean sweep by the Democrats.
So I had an intervention from Megan telling me that we have Joe Nye and Richard still with questions in the remaining minutes. So lightning round, Joe Nye, and then Richard. Bring it home.
Dan, that's a great talk. I wanted to press you a little bit further on China and the geopolitics of China. You mentioned the pipeline from Russia to China, but my impression is that China is going to be dependent upon Middle Eastern oil, which passes through the Straits of Hormuz and the Indian Ocean, where the Americans have naval supremacy. The question is, how long will that last? How long will China remain dependent upon that oil supply? Because when people talk about China using its pressure on Taiwan, they also have to think about what happens to what does the American Navy do to their oil supply? So if you think of renewables, if you think of the Russia pipeline, what is the time horizon that you would say China remains dependent on those flows of Middle Eastern oil through the Indian Ocean?
Well, China imports 75% of its oil, and a very large part of it comes exactly the way that you say, both from the Middle East and from Africa. So I think that that's actually the flashpoint, Joe. As you know and others know, there have been several near collisions of US and Chinese ships. The fact that only China claims that the South China Sea belongs to them, and I think a lot of it has to do people say, oh, there's a lot of oil under the South China Sea. Our geologists and others don't think so. It's really about that transit. So I think the Chinese, that's a major reason for them promoting electric cars. But they have, it's a big challenge because they've gotten so dependent on imported oil so fast on that scale that reversing it is a policy, diversification is its policy. They import oil from the United States now, but I think that will continue to be a flashpoint for some time. And, as you get this polarization between Beijing and Washington, if something does happen, the communication channels may not work very well. So that is something that, Belt and Road has an energy component in it, but I think that strategic dependence remains at least for a number of years.
Sometime means a decade or more.
Well, let me think, a decade. I think reasonably think just the penetration, the Chinese new car sales are 50% greater than the US. So I would think we're talking, half a decade to a decade. I mean, that will, but that's why the relationship, one reason, as they say in the book, that, a relationship that used to be based between Russia, Soviet Union, and China was based on Marx and Lenin. Good part of it, not all of it by any means, a good part of it is now based on oil and gas, and it has to do with those strategic issues.
Thanks.
And Richard, I think that the final question goes to you before we hand it back to Megan.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Dan, and congratulations on the book, and thanks for speaking with us. I just wanted to come back to Halima's question that you answered about the geopolitical importance of the United States of the Middle East in a world where, as you pointed out, you had this sort of textbook case of when the United States would be really concerned with an event when the Iranians attack the Saudi oil fields, the markets kind of shrug, US kind of moves on. And this is so radically different from at least the way most national security policymakers have thought about the Middle East's importance in American foreign policy. So if you fast forward a few years and this trend kind of continues, do you see a scenario in where the United States just doesn't really treat the Middle East as particularly special for oil economic reasons, energy reasons? And is it possible that China, for the reasons that Joe just pointed out, could actually see it as more important because their physical supplies are coming in, and somehow you have, if not a reversal of roles, some sort of shift in the relative roles of the United States and China?
I think that's a very reasonable question to look at. I mean, the U.S., I think it was in 1995 that the Fifth Fleet was reestablished for the Gulf region. Always could be said for oil, but in a budgetary pressures and so forth. I mean, you have to say post-Iran, I think as long as the Iranian issue is there, the U.S. is very engaged. But I think the countries in the region worry about the U.S. and then see China sort of stepping up its engagement in the region. It would be regarded differently. When I've talked to the countries there, it's not something they would welcome, but China's interests are there. And I think you go to another question that we didn't touch on, but really struck me when I was finishing the book, is the degree to which other countries are saying, we don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. The Prime Minister of Singapore had a very important article on that in Foreign Affairs. When I've been in, I hear that from Middle East countries. I did a dialogue with the President of Colombia, and he brought that up, where these countries are saying the strategic relationship was with the United States, but our main customer is China. And please don't let us get caught in the middle. And in a way, we've already seen that playing out with Huawei. So is that going to play out in other ways as well? I mean, in this book, obviously, we've been talking about a lot of these questions, peak demand, US, China, and history will deliver the answers. But what I've tried to do is have a framework for addressing and highlighting these questions. And the one you raised, Richard, is kind of one of the fundamental ones, because it goes back to, as Helima said, to the Carter Doctrine. It really goes back a lot farther than that. Will there be a shift, a loss of attention if oil is seen as less prime and the US is not, it remains more or less energy independent? And, when president after president said we want to be energy independent, it was a joke for, late night comedians. And, now it's turned into, unexpectedly, at least for now, into a reality.
Well, with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Megan O'Sullivan. I just want to personally thank Dan Yergin for a fascinating conversation today. And over to you, Megan O'Sullivan.
Great. Thank you so much, Helima, and thank you, Dan. We are at the hour, so I'll be brief. It's been a great conversation. Obviously, there's so much to talk about in relationship to Dan's new book, The New Map, which again, I commend to all of you. It's just shy of the bestseller list, so we want to help push it over that mark and squeeze out some of the more political books that are taking up the center stage right now. But obviously there are big questions about technology, about geopolitics, and we've touched on many today, but there are even many more elaborated on in his new book. I want to thank Helima for a dynamic and far-reaching set of questions, and thank everybody for joining us today. So I hope people have a good rest of their day, afternoon, and evening, and look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you.